Good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to have as our guest lecturer tonight Professor Antonio Morales, who will talk about early Middle Kingdom elite, official and royal strategies at Thebes, recent works by the University of Alcalá Expedition at el-Bahari. Professor Morales is assistant professor in Egyptology in the Seminar of Ancient History at University of Alcalá. He has been lecturer in Egyptology and research associate at the Freie Universität in Berlin, postdoctoral research at Heidelberg Universität, and assistant researcher at Mainz Universität. He has a PhD in Egyptology obtained from the University of Pennsylvania and has participated to several expeditions to Egypt. Well, what he's gonna tell us tonight in his position as director of the Middle Kingdom Theban Project is research conducted in a very key period in the later part of the 11th Dynasty and the beginning of the so-called classical period in the el-Bahari and in Asasif. The Spanish expedition has been investigating, clearing, documenting, and attesting many different tombs belonging to high official of that period. And we are very grateful that Professor Morales agreed to present the results of this research with us at the Museo Egizio. So thank you for being with us. And let me also tell you that this is the first invitation, but I would like you to pay a ticket. I would like to have you in presence here in Turin once we can, inshallah, after the pandemic crisis is over. But anyway, thank you very much for being with us, even though virtually tonight. For you, Professor Morales. You have to turn the mic on. We don't hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, inshallah, we can make it in person. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. And of course, I appreciate very much, and I am very thankful for this kind invitation of the Museo Egizio di Torino and the Amici Collaboratori del Museo. As you have just mentioned, I come to present the last 4 or 5 seasons that the University of Alcalá Expedition to the el-Bahari have been developing in the last 5 years. Obviously, we were talking about that before. The last season that correspond to the let me see if I can share now the screen. The last season, I think I don't have permission to share, so if they can give me permission, I will be able to share the screen. Not now. But as I said, the last season, the 5th season, which corresponds to the months of March and April, we couldn't really develop the season because of the global problem that we are suffering. And on the basis of the recommendations of the Spanish embassy, we returned to Spain, so we couldn't really develop the last season. Let me see if I can now share the screen. Yes, thank you very much for this technical issue. Okay, so first of all, I would like to present what is the project. I always start when discussing our expedition in Egypt with the institutions that make possible through the auspices and the funding, the development of this project in Egypt. We started in 2015 with our first season as Freie Universität Berlin Expedition, and for 2 years we continue like that with funding from the University of Vienna, Fritz Thyssen Foundation, and the Gazellec Foundation from Melilla in Spain. 2 years later, in the 3rd season, we jumped to the University of Alcalá. The University of Berlin was kind enough to allow us to share the project with the University of Alcalá, and we continue from Alcalá in Madrid with this project under the auspices of a huge number of institutions, associations that support us with funding and with the auspices, the rooms, space, and other supporting materials for the project. So we started from 2014 to 2016 in Vrije Universiteit, and from 2017 until 2020, and we hope that this winter we can develop our 6th season. We continue as University of Alcalá Expedition. For those who want to know more about our project, of course, I invite them to visit all our social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, website. These are social media resources that today, nowadays, are absolutely necessary for the projects, for the promotion of science and the results and the findings and the, let's say, sharing with society our developing projects. So I basically invite all of you to visit mainly the thebanproject.com website, where you will find more information about the project, including also in Spanish or English, including also articles, research articles, and general public articles on our findings and research. And of course, something very important that we cannot forget are the reports that we publish every year. Yearly, we have these 2 publications. We follow this strategy of, on the one hand, to publish the scientific extensive article in the Studien zur ägyptischen Kultur in Germany, usually in English, and an article, more brief, kind of briefer article in the Boletín de la Asociación Española de Egiptología in Spanish for those who cannot access English publications. The story of our expedition, of course, started 5 years ago, as I said, but this is not, as the director of the museum, Christian Greco, just mentioned. It is a very interesting site with a very rich potential for excavations, not only in regard to the late 11th dynasty and beginning of the 12th dynasty, but also in connection with New Kingdom sites of the level, such as, for example, the Temple of Hatshepsut and some other famous tombs in the area. And still there is much to do there. What you see in your image to the left is basically the initial excavations of one of the tombs that are in our concession, the tomb of the vizier Ipi from the beginning of the 12th dynasty, reign of Amenemhat I. And to the right, you have the image of Herbert Winlock, the director of the North American expedition of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Deir el-Bahari. A very important figure. It's a crucial individual in the story I'm going to tell you today about the findings, the interpretations, and the possibilities of the site. Herbert Winlock started excavating at Thebes around 1910, 1911, but he actually initiated excavation of these tombs of the Middle Kingdom by 1927. The excavations under his supervision or direction were extended until 1939, when, because of health problems, he was until 32, when he was suggested to go back to North America, where he became director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in between 32 and 39. Then after 39, he became emeritus professor, and he published most of what we know that he produced or he found in the areas of Deir el-Bahari, not only Middle Kingdom, but also New Kingdom and later periods. He published all these materials in between 39 until 1950, when he regrettably passed away. Here we have 2 more images of this very important figure. Winlock is a person that all our members of the project love and hate. Sometimes you have this double feeling about some people. Winlock was a fantastic writer. He wrote very interesting articles with a very particular, nice, stylish narrative. He was able to engage the readers to continue reading even difficult or very technical descriptions of his findings and interpretations. However, the problem was that Winlock, for example, in an article of 10 pages, he devoted 8 pages to talk about the visit of some famous dukes from England, the dinner, the silver they were using, how fantastic was the orange duck that they ate together with the wine, and then 2 pages about the findings and some little details, which somehow make things complicated in terms of understanding his writings and his excavations and findings. He was famous, as I said before, not only because of the Middle Kingdom research, but also because of other excavations and findings, including the Temple of Hatshepsut, where he also worked for a while. Going back now to the modern times, our expedition, as I said, started in 2015 at the University of Berlin. Nowadays, it is a group of 45 members, and as it happens in every research project that try to achieve quality, production, and reach society to explain in a good way discoveries, interpretations, and ideas, it is constituted by many members from different nationalities and from different disciplines. We include architects, historians, epigraphers, archaeologists, of course, specialists on ceramics, on mummification, on 3D. We have people who work on geology, on physical anthropology, and as it happens with all the projects, that will secure the capacity to interpret, first to collect and also to interpret positively the project, the data that we find in the project. And of course, very important not to forget our super wonderful friends, local workers who are supporting and helping all of us, including as well the inspectors, the Rais Ali Farouk, who is the director of the workers the head of the workers in our site, and of course the inspector of the Ministry of Antiquities. As I said, without them, it would be impossible to see what we are going to see in the following minutes. In terms of the context, and this is also something that helps me to explain the main goal of the project, we approach the study of the late 11th dynasty and the very beginning of the 12th dynasty with the goal, with the plan to try to understand which ones were the social, political, economic, religious mechanisms that help a series of kings and their officials and administration, starting with Mentuhotep II, to build or to rebuild the state in a way that, as Director Christian Greco mentioned before, gave way to the beginning of the classical period, the golden period of the Middle Kingdom, with literature, literary, architectural, artistic, iconographic, religious developments in a way that even the New Kingdom people understood the Middle Kingdom as the golden age of production, artistic, literary, etc. The important point to understand is that, in a way, our project also tries to modify previous interpretations on the first intermediate period. As most of you know, the first intermediate period for 75 years until, let's say, the last 10, 15, 20 years was interpreted as a dark period of social conflict, civil war, even climatic problems that have to do with the Nile and the agricultural production, which affected the economy, etc., etc. And of course, the main point that most of these scholars suggested was the lack of a central power, the lack of a king who organized and controlled the whole country. The arrival of Mentuhotep II should be seen, according to this theory, as a fantastic renovation of the country, reunification of different areas, and therefore the beginning of a new era, as it was understood officially by the later kings and peoples. However, nowadays, in the last 10, 15 years, we have modified our way of thinking. It seems that the climatic impact of the Nile, the waters, the agriculture was not perhaps as strong or as hard as we expected. There will be probably episodes of difficulties, but what we see in the archaeological register, looking at the different localities, having a look to the funerary equipment, the construction of the tombs, etc., is a growing or an increment, an increasing of power of local, not only authorities, local and regional authorities, but also the peoples. Somehow, the archaeological register offers us a view into a country without a central power, without a central administration, but with fantastic regional developments in terms not only of literary, artistic production, but also in terms of economic issues, administration, reorganization, etc. We have to consider that many of these regional powers now have access to expeditions and the richness and the treasures they can find, the luxuries they can find through these expeditions and contacts with Asia, Nubia, Libya, and somehow they are securing an income, which before, for example, in the Old Kingdom, was all this income was going directly into the central storage, the storage of the state and the crown. And this is somehow something we want to try to explain. What is going on at the end of the first intermediate period and how Mentuhotep II and later kings try to give order to that. Of course, the kings of the beginning of the 12th dynasty, and we will see that, for example, in literature, they tried to produce materials that justify the arrival of the king, again, and a strong king who can control the country, but also, in a way, it tries to justify or make propaganda in order to justify the access again to all these incomes that the king now at the beginning of the 12th dynasty cannot get because all these regional powers are trying to keep it. Of course, the original, from the point of view of history, the original problem starts when two great powers in Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south starts to conflict. The Theban power of governors in the area started by controlling the three provinces in the south and then launching an attack in trying to control more and more territories and resources, which ended up with a great conflict that we know of in the area of Abydos and Thinis. And from there, they tried to recover the rest of the country until Mentuhotep II, by year 39, probably he controlled more or less the whole unified country. That will be our, let's say, central protagonist or individual of the story. In order to start with the concession and our excavations there, we should start with the necropolis of El-Tarif. El-Tarif, which is a necropolis to the north of the areas of Asasif and Deir el-Bahari, was basically excavated by several famous archaeologists, including in the 80s, Dieter Arnold, who came to study these kinds of complexes, funerary complexes that belong to the governors of the area of the province of Waset, Thebes. As you can see in this plan, basically it is the central axis seems to mark the main area of the cultic area for the main governor with shafts where you have the internal areas for the deposit of the mummy of the governor and some subsidiary structures that show also this idea very typical in the Middle Kingdom of the connection in between different officials who try to get connected even in the funerary domain with his boss, with their superiors. I take I try to look at attention at this complexes because they will be used by high officials in the train of Mentuhotep II and later in the area of Deir el-Bahari. We will see it in a moment. And these are the kinds of tombs, but not flat as in El Tarif necropolis, but in the hills. And these are the tombs that belong to our concession. This will be a basic map with the representation of the areas we are going to talk now in the next 20-30 minutes. We have the flat area of Asasif here to the south of the access to the temple of Mentuhotep, and these northern hills where we have several other tombs of the late 11th and beginning of the 12th dynasty. This will be a view taken from a balloon of the main areas. We have, of course, let's say the massive hills of Kurna, but the areas that are interested to our project are basically the flat, the platform of Asasif, and these northern hills of Deir el-Bahari, where we have several tombs that belong to our concession. The way I'm going to present now our excavations in the area and our interest in terms of research can be divided, let's say, in three sectors. We have sector A to the west, with the main tombs of Henenu, who belonged to the reign of Mentuhotep II, and Ipi, the vizier of Amenemhat, one of the viziers of Amenemhat I. To the east, we will see sector B, where I will take your attention to the tomb E1. It's the first one we have excavated in the eastern sector. That's why the label E1, and which is a very promising monument because it seems not to have been robbed or sacked or accessed in the last at least 2-3 centuries, since the materials were reaching the ceiling and it was impossible to access the tomb. And then we have in the flat area, the platform of Asasif, the tomb of Jari and the tomb of Dagi, which also, as you can see, because I'm showing you different tombs from different sectors, will allow me to show you not only the different positions of the tombs on the basis of the prestige and the position and the titles of the owner of the tomb, but also different iconographic and architectural styles, which also talks about pre-reunification and post-reunification. Somehow we can also see chronological issues there, which are fantastic in terms of understanding the expansion of this necropolis during the late 11th and early 12th dynasties. Starting with sector A, there are 3 tombs in this area. We have the tombs of Henenu to their left and the tomb of the vizier Ipi to the right. In the middle, the tomb of Harhotep, which was included in our concession in the first year, but later the Polish team requested to continue excavating in the area, and we were happy to collaborate with them and to share with them our study and our work in the area. And now the tomb of Harhotep belongs to the Polish concession. I marked this tomb because in the later years of the 19th century, Maspero dismantled the internal structures, the corridor, the mortuary chamber, and the sarcophagus, delivered it to the Museum of Cairo, where we have been doing archaeological or basically epigraphic and architectural study of the chapel and the sarcophagus for publication. Somehow in the next years, we will have to collaborate with the Polish team to put together all this information, the excavation of the tomb itself, including the courtyard and the internal structures and the, let's say, the structures, the stones, limestone blocks that constituted the corridor and the sarcophagus chamber with the sarcophagus. In the eastern area, as I said before, to the east of Ipi, Henenu, and Harhotep, Winlock found several tombs. One of them, the tomb of Neferhotep, which seems to be dating to the late 12th dynasty, and we will study this in the next years. 2 tombs which seems to have been unfinished, according to Herbert Winlock. We will have to study this issue. And this tomb here far away, which is tomb E1, which, as you will see in my presentation, it's really, as I said before, is very promising. And finally, from the northern hills of the el-Bahari, looking now to the south, we see the platform area of Asasif, where we can locate the tomb of Jari in this area, away from the temple of Mentuhotep, which should be located in this area here, and the tomb of Dagi, which was excavated in the lower section of Kurna and the beginning of the platform of Asasif. All these photographs that I am showing to you, I would like to mention that belong to Patricia Mora, our photographer, who does a fantastic job. And I usually say that it is easy to explain all these materials, views, locations of tombs with these photographies that are absolutely fantastic. In terms of the owners of these tombs, and now you see a different perspective of the tombs of the sector A, we have, as I said, and that's why my title has to do with the importance of these architects of the Middle Kingdom, these real constructors of the golden period or classical period in ancient Egypt history, is these two officials. We have the chief steward Henenu. He was royal seal bearer, unique associate, king's attendant. Title somehow strambotic, but that really have things behind, I mean, important meaning that connects with administration, economy, control for the central state. Like, for example, overseer of the horn, hoof, feather, and scale. This is actually a title that was studied by Stephen Quark, who published an article in the Fellowship of William Kelly Simpson, a very interesting one, discussing the importance of this strambotic, interesting title. One of them also reminds me, I always say that to my mother when I visit her at her house, and she always says, you have to do here what I want. I am the owner of this house. It's the title overseer of what is and what is not. Is somehow it's really overseer of everything in a way. That's Mentuhotep II's reigns. Then if we see the structure of the tomb of Ipi, the beginning of the 12th dynasty, and the titles of the vizier, we also see a person who got very important titles, including the overseer of the seal kings, royal seal bearer, steward, archive scribe, member of the lead, even town overseer. And somehow it helps us to understand how architecture, location, and the expansion of the necropolis was working in this period from Mentuhotep II to the time of Amenemhat I. Here you have a view of our excavations in the upper area of the courtyard. It will be somehow here in this plan, which was produced by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 30s. Basically, these tombs in the northern hill are constituted by a huge courtyard, usually excavated in the rock like they did in El Taif, or sometimes using, as you can see here in the image, mud brick to build up one of the walls. Depending on the geomorphology of the area, they can excavate or build up walls with mud brick, which were then painted, covered, and painted with materials from the area to give a stone color to these structures. So we have huge courtyards. Usually at the bottom of the courtyard, let's say at the feet of the hills, we will be thinking more or less in this area. We hope to reach 1 year there. We have a small chapel. In the case of Henenu, we will see it later, a small Macbreak Chapel with a floor of limestone blocks was found. It was actually found by Howard Carter, who excavated in this area in 1909 and 1910 for a couple of years. And this chapel at the entrance of the complex seems to repeat the model of El Tarif, where we also got, even in a flat area, an entrance chapel in honor of course, the owner of the structure. Here is fantastic to have a chapel. If I were a priest from ancient times or a relative, it would be fantastic to have a chapel at the feet because you can really pay honor, visit, or connect with the deceased without having to go up to the main structure. Basically, a rock-cut tomb with a public area, a corridor, and a central hall, usually a squarish in shape, where you will have a stela or the statue of the deceased. Interestingly, in the case of EP, we will see it now, under the floor of the public area or public hall of cultic practices, they hide or they hit the descending corridor and the structure of the funerary chamber. We can see this also here. This is the area of the courtyard. We cut this in order to make it everything enter into a single page. Then we have the long corridor arriving to the public area, and under the public area floor, we have a corridor to the sarcophagus chamber. And the constructors of EP's complex were very clever because they also thought on avoiding someone to rob the sarcophagus chamber by hiding under an artificial or superficial floor created in the chamber, hiding the sarcophagus under it. We will see it now in these images that I'm sharing here, photogrammetry produced by one of our archaeologists, the head of the excavations in the complex of EP, Muhammad Osman, who created this photogrammetry. We have here this cultic chapel, and under the floor, of course, it has been sunk, and all the materials have been removed. There was a descending corridor. Still, we have some limestone blocks in situ, including this area for the closing and blocking of the access to the funerary chamber. And then the funerary chamber, where we have this kind of lip or border edge that allows the position, the depositing of the different blocks that could cover completely the sarcophagus and this interesting stone canopic box, which was attached in a very interesting engineering way to the sarcophagus. The interesting part is we are excavating in this area and we don't know if the vizier died before time and they have to leave the sarcophagus in this position without finishing this side of the chamber so that they could really manage to move this to the east and to include the canopic box and the sarcophagus chamber in a position. You can see here this 90 degrees cut edge, which is fantastic because it really indicates that the sarcophagus was going to be positioned in that way. Or perhaps ancient Egyptian constructors found here a kind of very hard rock stratum, which seems to indicate that they wanted to avoid excavating that area. It could be one of the two options. We hope to be able to manage to explain this in the near future. Here you can see clearly this section perfectly prepared for the positioning of the sarcophagus here. And here they started already with the cutting of the rock for the canopic box, but they didn't continue in this area. Perhaps because the vizier died or because there is a very strong rock, a different kind of stratum in this area, which our geologist has been studying for a while. Here you have, of course, one of our members taking some notes in the inside of the sarcophagus of the vizier EP, which includes not only the traditional iconography, false door, looking to the east, offering tables with all the different or particular offerings for the deceased, but also very interesting text in kind of cursive hieroglyphs, which we hope after the restoration of the sarcophagus to be able to translate. We have detected some very interesting text, traditional text like coffin text 335, for example, but we are waiting for getting all the fragments, which, as you can see, some of these fragments are new and they have shown up, they have been found in the courtyard, not really inside the tomb. So we hope to finish the excavations of the courtyard to initiate the reconstruction of the sarcophagus. Here, two of our members, Egyptian conservators who are working on the restoration of the inscriptions of the sarcophagus. This corner, this upper corner here shows the before and this shows the after. We have been testing different techniques, different methods before we really use extensively a single method for the whole sarcophagus. But the results by now are fantastic. And of course, our epigrapher really appreciates the fact that we are offering her these kinds of images and not these ones. It makes much more easier for her to work on the translation, identification, collation of the text, and also iconography. Here we have her looking at me after a photo where I was asking her to look professional, of course, as we try to do in the project. Looking outside, we have been working on the excavation of the courtyard. You will see that I am putting more time on EP because it's the tomb we have been working more seasons. Outside, we have been working on the upper courtyard. You saw images of the excavation in the upper courtyard before. And we were very interested on all this eastern section, as you can see here in the image, full of subsidiary structures, many of them already excavated and studied by Herbert Winlock and his expedition, but still we have so many questions that we really needed to go again through that, including on the other side, in the western area, the construction of a wall that was closing the western section of the courtyard of EP, which helped us to understand the chronological, let's say the referential chronology in relation to the next courtyard here, since one of the walls mount on top of the other, and that helps to understand what is going on in terms of the expansion of the necropolis. In this area here, marked as chamber for embalming materials, in 2017, Mohammed Osman initiated the excavation of the shaft. We knew that Winlock found what seems to be a deposit for embalming materials, but what we didn't know is that the materials that were found by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, most of them were left in situ. So we found what seems to be a group of 56 jars with the materials used for the mummification of the vizier EP, which give us very interesting material to understand the practices of mummification, the types of materials, the reutilization or reemployment of jars, probably used in the everyday life, and then taken here by the family and these followers of the vizier. These materials, now we have an archaeological photo in the image. These materials give us, as I said, so much information, and now we will proceed with the help of several experts. We have an expert on textiles, Elisa Yanez from Copenhagen. We have an expert on mummification, Salima Ikran, and some other experts on ceramics as well, who are going to study this deposit in detail. What you see inside one of the jars are these natron or natron bags, which were used for the mummification of the deceased. And here to the left, you can see details of a chalk writing inscription with hieroglyphs, which also we are working on it to try to reveal whether it is the origin, the owner, the donator, or even the name of the necropolis. There are several graffiti and symbols that seems to connect with some kind of sacred name of the necropolis of the el-Bahari, and we want to work on this theory. The emptying of the deposit was produced in 2017, which forces us in a way to work. As you can see, this is not pandemic time. This is only because the natron bag affects the smell and the eyes, and you can cry a lot because of the strong smell of these materials. And we proceeded to catalog and organize everything carefully. Here you have a couple of photographs of the work by Kei Yamamoto and Hassan, who work in the drawing of the materials, and our photographer Patricia Mora, who is also working on the photography of these materials. Salima Ikran, Raul Sanchez, who were working on the analysis of these textiles. We are talking about thousands of textiles of different types. some of them with a different technique of production, different materials, thickness. So somehow we have a rich deposit, a rich repertoire of textiles from approximately 2000 BC, which gives us also so much information on the production of textile and the work. And as you can see, there were all kinds of shrouds, textiles that were used, and they are full of resins, oils, blood. This one was probably used for the deceased, since it has the shape of the two arms, the two legs, and probably was used to be attached in the process of perhaps dehydration by the natron bags. Here you have some details also of these different production techniques for the production of textiles. Different thickness, different kinds of materials, even materials that seems to have been used to dip on the oil and to be used like lamps probably. And even we have some material that seems to be not connected with the deceased himself, but really with some kind of provisional structure, since the materials are so long that somehow they could not be used for the mummy, we think. And one particular, very exclusive element that showed up was the mummified heart of the deceased, which seems to have been taken care really effusively. You can see here the aorta has been, let's say, wrapped and even blocked so that nothing could enter into the heart. And the reasons why the heart show up in one of the jars, well, we have been considering several options, and we, in discussions with our forensic doctors, Enrique Dorado and Manuel Carrillo from the University of Alcalá, we consider that the shape, the size, the weight, and the appearance of the heart here to the left, once has been wrapped, seems to show some similarity with the natron bags, which could indicate that the embalmers, by mistake, included the heart into the jar instead of putting back the heart into the chest of the deceased. The deceased and the tomb has not suffered any attack, any damnatio memoriae process, any kind of destruction of the name of the deceased, which seems to indicate that this was a kind of wiki mistake, not really an attack on the deceased, as some people has mentioned when I discussed this discovery. Continuing after the section of the deposit, embalming deposit, Herbert Winlock found a tomb which was connected with a person who was buried there called Mesech, whose remains have not been relocated. But in the same tomb, Winlock found several documents, famous documents known by almost everyone today, which are the letters of Hekanakte, which are now deposited in the museum, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. These documents are fantastic materials for understanding the society, the economy, even family issues at the time of the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. These materials could have belonged to the person buried here. One of our theories is that perhaps Hekanakte was buried here, and later we know that Mesech came later. Mesech reused the tomb, getting rid of the materials, including these papyri, which were found basically under some accumulation of sand here in these steps. So perhaps Hekanakte was the one originally buried here, and Mesech reused his tomb. Last year, we found under the tomb a second deposit. This is the one of Ipi, and this one was found last year, as I said, and the appearance and the measurements are very similar to the previous one that we found with all the jars of Ipi. However, this one was sunk in antiquity. No single finding has been produced in this area. What we have found, on the other hand, was these ceilings, which remind us of the alive domain of the necropolis, not only in terms of burials, but also some other processes like the overseers of these complexes who have to take care, these hemuka who serve the these complexes and produce daily all kinds of economical issues and actions. And you can see here we have some of these remains of ceilings. We also found hundreds of chapties, most of them decontextualized because of the excavations of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They got rid of some of these materials, and we have not been able, unfortunately, to contextualize these objects. But most of these chapters come from the from the third intermediate period and the Ptolemaic times. Changing now for a moment to the epigraphic work of our concession in the Museum of Cairo. Here you have this dismantled funerary chamber of Harhotep, together with the sarcophagus, in which, as I said before, we have been working for the last, or with which we have been working for the last 3 years, mainly on the epigraphy and iconography, in order to produce a monograph on this fantastic, absolutely thrilling, colorful production of the beginning of the 12th dynasty. And not so long ago, my colleague Mohammed Osman and I produced an article on the texts that decorated and enriched the sarcophagus inside and outside, which are very interesting because basically most of the texts have to do with the traveling of the deceased on a boat through the horizon, accompanying the sun, the god Re, and also, very interestingly, transforming the sarcophagus into a boat and transforming the deceased himself into the captain of the boat, with very interesting and very enriching vocabulary that has to do with the production of boats. Very interesting and something absolutely fascinating that we know of in ancient Egypt. Now we transfer to another complex, the Tomb of Henenu. You will see that I'm not going to take much time for the other complexes, since we have not been able to work so much time, so many seasons in the others, but somehow I wanted to present all the other complexes. Here you have the complex of the royal steward Henenu. We started in 2017 with the cleaning of the upper section of the courtyard. Much of it has been destroyed. Clearly, here we should imagine a flat, shiny facade of yellow limestone, which would have been very attractive in the distance from the valley, from the central section or the platform area of Asasif, but that unfortunately nowadays is not in the same condition. In terms of the complex and the plan of the complex, here you have again a courtyard. This courtyard was excavated in the lower section, not in the upper one, but in the lower section by Howard Carter in 1909 and 1910. Here is where he found the chapel at the entrance of the complex. But I will focus now on this upper section. First of all, we will see these steps. This is something that I do not know of parallel, and if anyone knows in the audience, I would be happy to receive any message from you, please. These huge steps as wide as the courtyard. Here you have some remains, but we will see them in a moment in a better condition, more clean by the project. And also in terms of the internal areas, although the plan is a little bit irregular and doesn't seem to be very similar to the one of Ipi, we have to be careful because Henenu and Ipi constructed their complexes not so far away, not so distant in time. And what we think as a possibility is that the original plan was a long corridor to the squarish hall, as we saw in the case of Ipi. In this case, not under the floor, but behind one of the walls, we got a second corridor with the second hall and another corridor with another hall full of shafts and subsidiary chambers in both sides, west and east, which seems to indicate, in our opinion, that all this extensive area after the main hall and after the main hall and the block stone, we will have a descending corridor and the burial chamber, and somehow in later times they expanded with more shafts, more corridor, another corridor and another chamber, and also several subsidiary chambers in both sides. In most of cases, these subsidiary chambers or niche, as you see in the plan, were basically big enough for the deposit of a coffin or a sarcophagus, not more than that. Here you have an image of the steps, as wide as the whole courtyard, once we clean them. You have to consider that these steps have suffered a lot and they have been destroyed, but they must have been absolutely fascinating, attracting the view from the distance and showing or marking the complex of Henenu as the funerary monument of someone very important in the moment, and people will know about it. They will know who was this official who owned this fantastic funerary monument. In terms of findings, the Metropolitan Museum of Art already found several fragments for 5 stela. We have been able to add like 100 fragments more, which we hope to will help us to reconstruct this stela, and also fragments of 2 sarcophagi. It seems 2 sarcophagi. These are fragments that were used by the Metropolitan to start reconstructing one of the stelas of Henenu, which were inside the in the rock-cut tomb of Henenu. And this one, which appears in the Pushkin Museum, Fine Art, seems to have been given by Howard Carter to the museum, since the entrance date for this stela is 1910, just after Howard Carter excavated the chapel at the feet of the complex. We think that this is the stela that was located standing at the chapel at the entrance of the complex. We also found papyrus, these fragments of papyrus, which we think are fake. We hope our specialist on papyrology will certify this, will justify or will explain us if we are right. The shape of the hieroglyphs, for those who do paleography or papyrology, and the way as I said, the shape and the fact that they are using hieroglyphs on papyri, and even the quality of the papyri of this papyrus seems to show that it could be a fake copy. I'm going to finish in 5-10 minutes. I only have now 2 more sectors in which we haven't worked much. The sector B, we got this tomb of Neferhotep. Winlock found several interesting materials that have to do with magical practices. A hippo, similar to the one I have behind, and we know from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, for example, and several other objects like a wand, some dolls, etc. These are materials that have been integrated into several discussions that have to do with magical practices and the uses of everyday life materials for funerary magical purposes or for the afterlife. This tomb is very interesting because it has a chapel on top of the main entrance. You see the second entrance is the chapel. And Winlock found a very interesting couple of statues which are nowadays in the Cairo Museum, and the tomb E1, which is, here you have some manual plans that our architects initiated. They also use 3D, which is basically the way we are reconstructing the plans of each of the tombs, 3D, which also allows, we are preparing the printing, the preparation of a whole chamber of EP in 1:1 scale for people to be able to visit it and see the kind of funerary chambers they built at this point. This is the entrance into E1. There was a main huge shaft, probably from later periods, in front of the entrance, and for some geomorphological reasons, basically the raining is coming toward this area and has produced this destruction in the upper courtyard area. As for the main corridor, as I told you, I don't know if you see at the back, but we have cleaned the corridor, which was full of debris up to the ceiling, which didn't allow anyone to enter for at least the last centuries, which is promising here. I don't know if you see, but the material goes to the top and it's impossible to enter. And this is promising in terms of finding at least interesting remains and data. And finally, again, looking to the south, the tombs of Jari and Dagi. Jari, who was buried away from the king Mentuhotep II, was supervisor of the prison complex. We know several people, including another supervisor of prisons called Intef, who were working on this complex, this institution in Egyptian Heneret, and this Heneret is understudied. I myself have been working on the study of this institution because there are some discussions on whether we are talking about a prison or a labor domain that force some people to pay to the state by means of doing some labor for a couple of years, 3 years, etc., depending on the payments they own to the government. But also it tells us that in terms of the expansion of the necropolis, he is far away, more than some other people like the vizier, Ipi, and Henenu to the north and Dagi to the south, because he doesn't have, we have to look here, the amount of titles and, of course, the prestigious vizier title of Dagi. That also will allow us to continue working on the idea of the social funerary development of the necropolis. Also, in terms of quality, the tomb of Jari is cut on Tafla limestone. As you know, most of you will know, it's a very soft stone, not very solid, difficult to work with. It's not difficult to work for in terms of cutting, but difficult to keep it solid. And that's why the condition of the tomb are not good. Here you have a view of the northern sections. The paintings are not in good state. And in the southern section, this area, we see these wooden structures which were deposited here. They were installed here by Herbert Winlock in the 20s, and later, probably, sorry, not in the 20s, in 1931, which is the year he excavated here. And later they were changed by the Ministry of Antiquities, in order to cover some of the interesting paintings, which we hope in the next years to work and to recover. Here you have a funerary garden without taking away any value for the fantastic and precious discovery of the Jehuti project in Abu el-Naga. We have here a funerary garden discovered by Herbert Winlock in 1931. The problem is at that point, he was not focusing so much on the Macbreak structures. You know that archaeology at that moment was more focused on the aesthetically beautiful objects for the museums, and somehow they didn't pay so much attention to questions like Macbreak structures like this one here. We hope in the near future to recover, once we excavate the courtyard, to recover the remains of this structure and to see how much we can learn from that. And in regard to the paintings, we have reached not so long ago an agreement with University College London to count with 3 specialists on the conservation and restoration of paintings of this type, as we see here. Very interestingly, iconography and architecture shows, as I said at the beginning of my talk, different chronologies. What we have here is the Theban style pre-reunification, which is very interesting because of the local characteristics, like, for example, the shape of the human bodies, the eyes, the use of the colors, and in this case, something already discussed by Catherine Roerich in one article, very interesting, in which she discussed whether the author of this painting was playing with the audience or it was a kind of mistake he did. In agreement with her, I think the author knew perfectly what he was doing, and he was playing with the audience. Look at the legs, at the position of the heads, the tails. which one is going at the front and which one is at the back. It's a very interesting play with the audience. And considering that this was painted in the facade of this Saf tomb with these pillars, we can say that the author was waiting, the painter, the artisan who did this, the artist who did this was expecting someone to look at it. A very interesting theme is this idea of men taking figs from a fig tree of the sycamore, with these two gazelles trying to reach them too. Here you have this drawing by Winlock in 1931, preserved or kept in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And now jumping to the Tomb of Dagi, more solid, more monumental than Jari, and better situated in front of the temple of Mentuhotep II. And very interestingly, he's using the same Saf tomb style of Jari, but we know that in later times, he closed this section of here with this left pillar and this right pillar, so that he gave to his tomb, even if the facade was still a Saf tomb style, he was giving to his tomb this appearance of a single corridor to a square area for cultic purposes, similar to the ones of Ipi and Henenu, which seems to indicate also two typologies, pre-reunification and then the construction of one single axis tomb post-reunification. And this is basically structures that belong to the monastery of Saint Epiphanius that came much, much later in Coptic times. This is the position of the complex of Dagi. You can see how it is in front of the complex of Mentuhotep II, as well as Henenu and Ipi, who enjoy this position here. No one tried to bury himself in the internal area following this line here, this frontal line of the temple. Whoever was buried here, we know there are people buried there, but all of them came much later, because everyone in the late 11th and beginning of the 12th respected also the hill area, the hills, in honor of the king who got all this area, which later was, let's say, modified by the construction of Hatshepsut. Here you have a view from the inside of the tomb of Dagi, looking at the north. He's just in front of the royal steward Henenu. Here you have the harim of our excavation, and he's just in front of Henenu, and they are the first ones, Henenu to the north and Dagi to the south, who respect this frontal line of the temple. So probably indicates that they were, well, not in the north. In the north, after Henenu, still we have Heti, a tomb that belongs to the Polish concession, which seems to be the first one who was respecting this line to the front of the temple of Mentuhotep II. The images are good, but not good enough to show the details that I will show you now, like these cows crossing the river, the production of bread, and the hieroglyphs presenting all the titles of the vizier Dagi. And in our original cleaning, not excavation, cleaning of the tomb, we already found fragments of these scenes with paintings of these figs, again, reminding us of these figs of the tomb of Jari, these figs of the sycamore, and this idea of men accessing these figs of sycamore and the gazelles, nature surrounding these men, have to be contextualized in the area of the el-Bahari in connection with the cult to the goddess Hathor, patron of the necropolis of the el-Bahari. And finally, the sarcophagus of Dagi, which is in the Museum of Cairo, which is given much discussion and much debate, because outside he only mentioned the title supervisor of the portal of the king, or the royal supervisor of the portal of the palace. Dagi. If you are vizier and you have all these titles, you will want something more than supervisor of the portal. Some scholars have discussed the possibility that this sarcophagus belonged to someone called Dagi, who was buried inside the tomb of the vizier Dagi, but was not the vizier Dagi, but someone else from a relative who got the title supervisor of the portal. Some other people, I perhaps support this second option because of the quality of the sarcophagus and the painting and the iconography and the text support the idea that perhaps the sarcophagus was produced in the early career of this vizier, when he still was not a vizier of Egypt. Something very interesting to finish is the presence of hieroglyphs on the floor of the sarcophagus. Remember, we have seen so many coffins, wooden coffins with text, but in Deir el-Bahari, we have the sarcophagus of Dagi and the sarcophagus of Ipi. We didn't see in detail. Both of them have these inscriptions with religious text on the bottom of the sarcophagus, which is also a very particular and interesting aspect. And with this, I finish this presentation, and I hope you have enjoyed these 4 or 5 years of excavations in Egypt. Unfortunately, the 5th year was this last March and April, and we couldn't make it completely, which was very bad, but we hope to be back, as we were discussing before when we were preparing this presentation with the director of the museum. We hope all of us to go back to Egypt as soon as possible and to get resolved this important problem that we have this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your amazing lecture and for the material that you presented us. It was really amazing. Actually, you brought us to a wonderful trip to the el-Bahari, from the el-Bahari to the Asasif, and you showed us actually this wonderful development into the classical period of the Middle Kingdom. Well, there are many things that I would like to ask you, besides congratulate you for the lecture and also for the quality of the images that you showed us, which was really amazing. I want to ask you concerning the line that you said. There is this line that let's say on the west, that you don't go further towards the temple of Mentuhotep, and of course in talking about the tomb of Jari farther away and then of Dagi, you also showed how there is a social layering. It was also very clear when we were inside with you on the tomb of Dagi that we're just in front of the tomb of Henenu. Have you realized whether the choice to go to the north or the south was also a kind of social distancing, so to be situated to the northern hill instead of being on the flood on the south was also related to the social structure?
It's a very interesting questions that we have into consideration. Still, we don't have answers because we need to understand the necropolis better and to see how it grows and how the different complexes are growing. Our impression is that Dagi was probably excavating and preparing his tomb much before than some other peoples who prepared their tombs in the northern hill. So somehow Dagi seems to have chosen the feet of Kurna looking at the temple of Mentuhotep II because of the quality of the rock and because of the small platform he could create for himself. And from this platform, he has fantastic view of the temple. On the other hand, another important protagonist of this period, individual of this period, Heti, a tomb who belongs to the Polish mission, also seems to be the first one to the north, respecting this, let's say, line to the west. And the idea, as you say, that who came first and whether they were jumping from one side to another depending on social position and prestige is something very important, but still we don't have material enough to discuss. It would be good to know the necropolis better, and there will be a point in terms of chronological order of each of these officials when we can say, he came before, he was the first, Heti came later, which seems to be the case. That will be my provisional answer. But it seems that after Dagi, people jumped to the northern hills with Heti and Henenu, and it became much more interesting that area because it's also a higher section than the platform of Asasif. Of course, those who could not get there, still they were thinking to try to get in Asasif as close as possible to the king. So let's say that the idea that answering who was moving and where they were building the complexes can give us details, and data is absolutely fundamental, yes, but still the answer is provisional, let's say.
Yes, well, it's also so amazing to realize the sacredness of this place that remains through history, because of course when we think, of course, much later even of the cachette located in the very area, especially the Bab el-Gazus, which is just to the bottom on where you are excavating. Well, of course, we all hope that in excavating the garden of Jari, you will have the same result of the Jehuti project, which was just amazing. But I mean, the material that you have shown us also from the tomb of Ipi was just fantastic. All the embalming material and the textile. I just didn't get is there a relation between Mezech and Ipi? Are they related somehow?
It's difficult to say. It doesn't seem to be the case. The coffin of Mezech, this wooden coffin that was found there, it is of very bad quality. Even the hieroglyphic Hetep Dinesu formula, which was written, was done with chalk. Basically, they used some carbon, black ink, to paint, to inscribe quickly a Hetep Dinesu formula that even didn't make it because of the size of the hieroglyphs. The Hetep Dinesu formula, by the time the artist or whoever did it finished, he was still in the middle of the coffin. And that's all they did. Half of the coffin panel read with the Hetep Dinesu formula, and the ceramics seems to show that we are just well into the Middle Kingdom, not really at the early 12th dynasty, which seems to mean that it came after the original owner. And that's the problem, that we cannot connect Mezech with Ipi directly on the one hand, and on the other, the letters of Hekanakte mention Ipi. So somehow there could be something there that could explain that Hekanakte was indeed connected with Ipi and not Mezech, who came later. Another interesting aspect, which I noticed last year, was that it seems that someone called Ipi was the supervisor of the funerary complex of Mekhetre. So somehow there is also this idea that the high officials are becoming supervisors of the mortuary monuments of their predecessors. Actually, Ipi seems to be the successor of Mekhetre in the title of royal overseer, etc. So somehow these people are not only succeeding each other, but relating every day in the court, in the regional court, and somehow naming them, appointing them responsible for their properties and their funerary domains, etc. So in the case of Mezech, I think we are talking about someone secondary who seems to come later and is not so, at least, directly connected with Ipi at all.
Thank you. And there are many questions, so I'm going to read them for you. Sandra Veprowska, very interesting embalming assemblage. Does every jar bear these spot marks, or was the only example? Are there any traces of these courtyard gardens within other tombs in this area?
We have around seven jars with these spot marks, and the pot marks are different. Not all of them are the same. The poor quality of the painting or the inscription doesn't allow very clear identification, and we hope to be able to work on this with the software, for example, that allows through photography to improve the quality of these paintings or these inscriptions or marks to see what they say. And in terms of the courtyard gardens, Jari was the only one that showed a courtyard garden. Perhaps these courtyard gardens lost their function. I mean, this is a hypothesis I have been considering. By the time they built these huge entrance chapels into the complexes, and at that point you don't really need, or you are not interested in having a garden. We haven't found any funerary garden in any of the huge monuments, huge funerary complexes. However, when excavating Jari, with a more reduced and more limited courtyard in front of the South tomb, south facade, sorry, Winlock found this fantastic funerary garden. The problem of the funerary garden also is that not only Winlock didn't pay much attention, but somehow no one was interested on it. And after, of course, almost 100 years, the conditions of this garden are absolutely different than, for example, what in a very fantastic way Jose Manuel Galan and the Yehuti project found some years ago. And we think that we will obtain information, but unfortunately, perhaps not as good as what they got.
So I have another question. Alexander Hallman, thank you for your very interesting lecture, Antonio. Amazing material. Can you tell if all textiles belong to the tomb owner? Is it possible that some are from later periods? Any sign of intrusive burials, mixed materials? And one more question, did you find any painted textiles?
Wow, so many questions. Well, I am happy that people are excited about the topics, of course. We found the textiles are into these jars, and the jars seems to be connected with, the jars are in this subsidiary deposit, which is the closest subordinate structure to the entrance to the tomb. So somehow it's the most connected to the facade, first of all. There is no inscription in any of the textiles. That's why we saw Salima Ikran and Raul Sanchez using ultraviolet technique to see whether we could recognize some ink in it. So there is no way directly to connect by name or by the name of the owner or the name of the monument, the material with him. In terms of the textile, all of them seems to be from the same period. There is no, let's say, intrusive material from later times, which means that is a closed repertoire. You know, when talking about these assemblages, for example, one looks to Mequetre. I visit the Metropolitan Museum, and I was lucky to be shown the Mequetre textiles, and all of them belong to Mequetre, and all of them seems to have not been used. However, our materials have been used. It's completely the opposite. Mequetre was storing things that perhaps were the remainings of the mummification. We don't know, but they were clean. Clean and folded and, let's say, well stored in an organized way. Our materials are unorganized, put into jars full of natron, oil remains, some kinds of resins, even blood, what we think to be blood, and they seems to be clearly a closed repertoire. There is not any intrusive material later. And the last one was painted textiles. No, we don't have. At least there, we don't have painted textiles. These textiles are absolutely without any decoration at all.
So I have another question similar to the previous one from Filippo Mi. Thank you very much for this presentation. I had a similar question to the above one. Apart from the chapters and the shaft, are there other traces of reoccupation in later periods, in particular from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods?
Yes, the answer is definitely yes. There are some intrusive burials. Two of them were found inside the Sarcophagus Chamber of Ibi, and they seem to belong, based on the few remains of textiles we found, to the Ptolemaic Roman, let's say Ptolemaic times. However, again, in this line of, as I said before, feeling of hate and love to Herbert Winlock, he decontextualized so many things that sometimes it's difficult to study in a good way the materials. We have human remains. I think you saw our forensic doctors working with the head of an individual, and we have the torso of another person. Both of them were found inside the tomb, but also we have 2 or 3 fragments of, let's say, the torso, the upper part and head of 2 or 3 persons who were buried somewhere, but we found them decontextualized in the middle of the courtyard. So we cannot really contextualize and explain where they come from.
So I have another questions from you, from Reham Zaki. Thank you so much for this interesting talk about your impressive work. About the several jars that contains mummification material, are all of them belong to the tomb owner or not?
or some of them. Well, what we know is all these mummification materials, as I said before, is a closed repertoire with textiles, natron bags. There is also a straw inside these jars, sand. There were also, well, there are all these kinds of bandages and textiles and wrappings and shrouds. But all of them seems to belong to a closed repertoire, and this assemblage was found inside a structure connected with the facade of the tomb. That's the maximum thing at this point we can say about it.
So another question by Madi Lorenzi, talking about the very interesting art that you saw show us. So the docu about Ibi's heart, the natron bags looked quite small. How was the range in size of natron bags? Professor Ikram mentions only small bags.
Well, Salima Ikram Professor Ikram was mentioning small bags because in general, all of them are small, but there are, like, we will say, if we have to distinguish, there are three sizes. There is a size, let's say, I don't have a way to explain it, but somehow you need the two hands to get one of them. We are talking about 2 or even 3 kilos of natron. They are very heavy. You have some of them with more or less 1 kilo natron, and some of them are really small, really, really small. And these small ones, beautiful ones that, of course, they have been done in textile with the natron inside, and even they have used the linen wrapping to close it and to make a knot. These ones probably could have been used perhaps for the cavities or for the areas that have to cover the body. This is also interesting in terms of the practices. We think, I have seen it in several books and manuals, natron, let's say a natron on top of the deceased, covering the deceased completely. But at this point, it seems they are using these bags to cover the whole body. Salima Ikram mentioned even that you need around 200 kilos of natron to cover one single person. And this is somehow what we found. Again, 250 kilos of natron bags for a single person in a closed repertoire. Again, we don't have the definite connection with the vizier EP. Let's say it would be fantastic to have the inscription, but all of them seems to indicate that all these very prestigious, very luxury, well-known, well-produced textile material was connected with the vizier.
Another question, Sylvia Zago. Have the religious texts inscribed on the bottom of the sarcophagi been studied and or been published? Do they belong to the collection of coffin texts? Thank you for the wonderful lecture, by the way.
Yeah, Sylvia Zago, I knew she was going to talk, of course, about religious texts. I love her, and I love her production of her publications also. Unfortunately, and this is something we are working on, we want to use the inscriptions at the bottom of Dagi to see if we can find some kind of parallelisms in the bottom of EP. And I say this because the bottom of EP is really in very bad condition. It seems, of course, this is logical. The bottom is the section of the sarcophagus that suffers more in terms of liquids, any fire, the decomposition of the body. Of course, all this is affecting the bottom of the sarcophagus, and the inscriptions there are almost disappeared. We have found individual hieroglyphs. You see an M here, Aleph there. You have some symbols here and there, but we cannot really build up a text, at least by now. We hope that perhaps with the restoration of the sarcophagus, we will be able to identify more pieces of text.
Another question, Francesco De Gaetano. Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture about the TT 316, the Bowman Neferhotep. There are clear evidence for this dating. Amenemhat III, Sesostris III. Moreover, there could be some reason to such a later burial between 11th Dynasty officials. Thank you.
This is a very interesting question also. I didn't discuss because, of course, I have to limit myself, and I really went beyond.
You were perfect. You were perfect.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I thought I was really late, far away. It's a very good question. I will start with the second question. It is not strange that some people during the 12th dynasty decided that this area was an old section of the necropolis with very prestigious individuals, perhaps still with a very alive, at least in the memory of the community, very alive image and memoir, let's say. And it was not strange to try to locate yourself in between, let's say. Actually, some of these monuments, including Harhotep, this TT314 is from the time of Sesostris I or Senwosel I, and this one is already looking at the orientation is completely different because he needs to situate himself in between two previous complexes, and the only location he has in the rock doesn't allow him to look at the temple of Mentuhotep. Perhaps he was no longer interested in looking at Mentuhotep II, but to look at the city of Thebes, to look at the east, to the Nile. Perhaps he's looking at the entrance of the causeway that goes into the area, the sacred area of Mentuhotep II, which was also important to look at this area since you have so many celebrations, rituals, and practices in the entrance into the causeway. That will explain also why someone like the bowman Neferhotep built his tomb in an area where seems to be in between tombs of the 11th to the east and the tombs of also late 11th and early 12th to the west. He is in between. As for the evidence, it's based on the materials, the objects that have found there. We haven't really studied in detail the equipment since it is in Cairo, a few objects, and we are still so busy with the late 11th and beginning of the 12th that some of the tombs in our concession, we prefer to postpone it until we know better the necropolis.
Thank you. And the last question, Sarah Cabras, thank you very much for this lecture. What is the chronology of the extended sector of the tomb of Henenu? Was it made for members of his retinue or family, or just reused for later burials not related to the owner? Also about Henenu, what was the final context of the stela fragments?
Okay. We haven't yet studied in detail this expansion of the tomb of Henenu, but our impression is that it is not connected with the original owner. One of the reasons is that although they use the same scheme of corridor chamber, still you have to consider that the burials are done in 3, 5, 6 meters down shafts, and the shafts were not used in this time. So the shafts seems to have come later, New Kingdom, Third Intermediate Period, even later. We need to excavate the shafts. We know there are at the bottom of the shafts materials. Some of them seems to be from Ptolemaic times. But even if the shaft was done in the New Kingdom, still we could have materials from the Ptolemaic times of someone reusing the New Kingdom shafts. But still, we need to wait until we excavate all these shafts. We have around 7 shafts in the tomb, which are not typical from the 12th dynasty, which means that they are probably part of an expansion produced later. As for the stela of Henenu, in the 60s, Hayes from the Metropolitan Museum of Art produced an article in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology where he discussed the possible reconstruction of up to 5 stela, and this stela will be located along the corridor inside the rock-cut tomb structure in the public section, of course, where people could see this stela probably at both sides of the corridor. Harhotep, Winlock mentioned also the remains of 2 stela from the corridor of Harhotep, which we need to look at this in detail because it's a good parallel for what we found in Henenu years before. So that somehow explains the context of this stela. The only thing exception, let's say, apart from this would be the stela or the statue that probably was situated in the chapel at the entrance of the courtyard in the bottom area. For those, let's say for the members of our project, for example, that every day go at 6:30 up to the hills, it is very clear that having a chapel at the feet of the complex was very important, because when you arrive up, I'm sure no one will have breath to recite anything until after 15 minutes of recovery.
Well, thank you so much for your lectures and for the wonderful material you presented us tonight. And thank you for all of those who have followed us tonight. And I would like to remind that the following lectures, a lecture will be on the 2nd of March, held by Professor Manzo from l'Università L'Orientale di Napoli, and he will talk about Egitto e Africa, uno sguardo dal Sudan orientale. Thank you again to everybody. Antonio Morales, I hope to host you in Turin when the pandemic is over, and good luck with the resuming of your work, inshallah, very soon.
Inshallah. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye.